Welcome, everybody, to Aeon Byte. And I know some of you are surprised by this intro video, but as I told Mitch, I always like to surprise people. So why not one of the most heartbreaking scenes in all of history, which is the prom scene of Carrie, filmed by Brian De Palma, based on the Stephen King novel. And you heard Blind Melon. Why would I do that? Yes, I got this from the internet. A guy named Hall and Oates created it, and I borrowed it. So we'll see what YouTube has to say. But I thought it's very, I don't know, it is very Gnostic, and it does kind of exemplify Gen X after all. Blind Melons, No Rain really taps into what our generation, the existentialist anxiety, the quiet anger, the delirium, and all that. And people have always wondered, well, what's wrong with Gen X? And the answer is always probably that we read too much Stephen King, Dinar Koontz, Clive Barker when we were young. Now that I look back, maybe I shouldn't have been reading this stuff when I was 16, but some say it messed our entire generations. But Mitch, thank you very much for being on the show. And what do you think of this, everything I've just said?
It's all Stephen King's fault. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, those novels were pretty mind-blowing back then.
Very mind-blowing. My two favorite Stephen King novels are Salem's Lot and The Shining. And
Mm.
I would actually say that Salem's Lot, in terms of structure, is a model novel. I'm not a fiction writer, but I think that aspiring fiction writers would be doing themselves a good turn to read Salem's Lot and not only look at what King did in that book, but the research that went into it.
Mm.
I don't think that King receives enough credit for, I'm not talking about occult research per se, but for example, in Salem's Lot, he understands and writes about how the power grid, the electrical grid of a town is laid out and how things can go wrong. And, that's obviously informed by research. And I just thought it was a perfect book.
Yeah, I would have to say, God, that's a good one. The
So I don't
Stand,
blame him for
probably for
everything.
me. Yeah, you don't.
Yeah.
I know he kind of freed us to the reality of the world and the occult, supernatural world, if you would. And you got to admit, Brian De Palma is a great director when you
I
look
love
at
him.
that scene, and then we forget what a good actress Sissy Spacek was. You can tell in slow motion she is not acting. She really thinks she's Carrie,
Yeah.
happy and going to get that, win the prom queen. And then, of course, dick ass John Travolta throws the blood on her face, which is kind of a theme for our lives, right? We think we're getting there, everybody's happy, and
And then comes
boom.
John Travolta. Right.
And I didn't know, but the guy who playing her date, that's a greatest American hero. I
Thank you.
forgot.
I feel less alone in the world now. Yes, thank you. I sat through every episode of that terrible show,
I
and I
loved
loved
it.
it, and I will always stand by it. Robert Culp played the FBI
Brilliant.
agent or whoever his
Yeah, his
sponsor
handler,
was.
his handler.
Yeah, his handler. And I've noticed that both in Great American, excuse me, in both Great American Hero and Carrie, high schoolers are all aged about 35 years old. And I noticed this in the Grease movie too. It's like
Yeah.
they can't find 18-year-old kids, who don't
Yeah.
have to be in school.
What about Patrick Swayze in Dirty Dancing? He's like 40.
I
He's
know.
like fondling high school girls. It's like, what?
I mean, at least, Fast Times at Ridgemont, they kind of look like kids, and I'm looking at this crowd and I'm like, is this the reunion? Did Miguel use the wrong clip? This is, Carrie 2, the reunion.
Carrie too, yeah, 20 years later. Exactly, in some undead world or whatever. So, well, I'm glad you enjoyed it, and welcome everybody to AM Bite. I always like to do something different. See you in the chat. Vance cannot make it. He's tied up at work because it's Monday, and Mondays are gonna Monday, right? So it'll be just Mitch and I. So everybody be cool in the chat. Don't turn it into the Chatico. And if you have any questions for Mitch, please super chat him because I'll be handling both. I have my eyes on both places, and we'll definitely get to it. So very excited to talk about your book, Mitch. But first, and I apologize, I don't want to make this all about me, but I wanted to sort of announce it on social media, but make it a audio announcement for the listeners. But my Elvis book has been accepted by a publisher, should be out in 2024. Mitch was instrumental from last January, me saying, Mitch, I got these ideas. What should I do? And you're like, just write the book, dude. You did it, helping me out through the process and connecting me to certain people. You've been very grateful and gracious, Mitch, to make this Elvis book come out, and I'm very excited. So thank you, Mitch. And yes, Elvis, America's Magician will be out next year.
And it's such a great book. Having read the full manuscript, I can say that with full confidence. It's so beautiful. And I am the number one fan of The Man from Tennessee. And I discovered stories in there that I hadn't known and insights that had not occurred to me. And you really captured Elvis as the consummate American seeker and how much he meant to us, how much he meant to our culture, and how deeply dedicated he was to the search. I think that it really would have been remarkable to, sometimes on occasion you meet famous people and what do you talk about? The weather, I have no idea. But with Elvis, you could dive right in. I mean, his reading list is probably very similar to that of a lot of the people watching tonight. And it's such a wonderful book. I devoured it in about 2 sittings. And I know when it comes out, it's going to make a real difference in how people understand the man.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think we need, in a way, we need Elvis. We need Elvis more than ever. He really is American culture, the good, the bad, but he really sort of kept it together. It's almost like he was the personification of post-war American. Well, you read the book, and I was even when I was writing, I was like, oh well, Mitch, it has to be Mitch. A, number one Elvis fan. Two, been into occultism for decades. Three, embedded in the publishing world. So you were like the trifecta. You were like, if there was a case study or an audience for this book, you would be it personified. So
Well, one
thank
of the
you.
things I like in the opening of the book is you point out there are Beatles people and there are Elvis people, and it's not that one dislikes the other, and it's not a contest, but inside of us there's that core fan. I'm always been a core Elvis fan. You know, that's always been it for me, and I felt musically, you know, in terms of being an audience member, I felt very lost in the late '70s because I was looking for that raw sound, and then I found it in the Ramones, and it changed
Hmm.
everything. But it was Elvis that was at the foundation of that. Anyway, all this is to say the book is such a delight, and I'm so excited for it to come out. And it's got a killer title, killer author, and you did it. You know,
Thank you.
the counsel was just write the damn thing, and you just wrote the damn thing, and it
Exactly.
worked.
That's what you said.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. It's you're talking about the famous scene in what's the name? Pulp Fiction, where the Mia Wallace character, you've got Ask Vincent Vega. John Travolta, he's sulking and she's filming him. She's like, there are two kinds of people in the world: Elvis people, Beatles people. They might like each other's music, but they can never join. That tells you
never.
who you are. And I thought I was always a Beatles person until last January when you told me to write the book. I
Yeah,
became an Elvis person.
it's very exciting. Well, maybe we can do a special episode of Aeon Byte where I interview you.
Sure,
You know,
sure. Yeah, let's
yeah,
have fun. I'm giving Carrie introductions, so everything's on the table. And
right.
a book that I think Elvis would have loved, like you read in the book, he used to have wherever he traveled, tour, when he went out, he had an entourage of workers that whose only job was to carry 200 books of the occult, so he would read it. It's a pit. If your book had come out, he probably would just want one book he could have taken on a trip. That would be Modern Occultism. He would have been very happy. So tell us about your new book.
Well, it goes. It publishes tomorrow, so this is really the evening launch, and I'm so excited about it. I worked very hard on it. It's always difficult for any writer to talk favorites. You know, what's your favorite book? I mean, I don't know that I have a favorite, but if I could hand one, you know, to somebody, it would be this one. I really dedicated myself to trying to write a sprightly, exciting, dramatic, but rigorously researched and deeply sourced and referenced history of occultism as a thought movement from late antiquity until the present. And it brought up a lot of emotion for me because it helped me to realize that we in the West, and I would define West not only as North America, Europe, but also I think arguably Middle East, Persia, even North Africa, Egypt, in the sense that these were the territories occupied by Alexander the Great, and this formed the foundation of Western culture. So I have a very broad definition of the West, but also a very definite one, because people may look at this and say, well, gee, where's the esoteric material about Hinduism, Buddhism, Shinto, Taoism, animism? And my response to that is that we in the West are in a very unusual position in terms of our religious history, in that if you grew up in India and you grew up in the Hindu faith, you're part of a faith that has been practiced for millennia. Likewise, Buddhism. Although China is officially atheistic, you have similar traditions: Confucianism, Taoism, Shinto in Japan, shamanism, other parts of the world. We don't have that history in the West. We experienced a very deep schism in late antiquity, where all the polytheistic and seasonally based and initiatory religious traditions were, over a course of time, because nothing happens right away, but over a course of time, were fully wiped away, first by the advent of Christianity and then later by the advent of Islam. And the Abrahamic religions that hold sway throughout the West today are not at our root. They're not at our core root. We have millennia of history where these mystery traditions, seasonal based traditions that came to be called occult or hidden during the Renaissance, they were the groundwater of Western life in terms of belief, philosophy, and for that matter, science, art, culture, because everything coalesced around this quest for an unseen world. Alchemy becomes chemistry, astrology and astronomy are joined, symbol and architecture are joined. Everything is really joined into one whole from which belief can't be extricated. And yet, there occurs this schism in late antiquity where the so-called pagan powers in Christendom, early Christendom, are in a struggle for dominance, and obviously Christendom prevails, and everything that was known goes underground. Of course, it's reintegrated into other traditions, other names. Nothing ever fully disappears. It's built on top of, both literally and figuratively, and yet we have this strange discontinuity that other nations and cultures don't have. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, I view occultism as a revivalist movement, a movement that is the inheritor of just strands and fragments from antiquity, because what else do we have? We've lost so much. And yet in our own era, right now, in our generation, we've got Nag Hammadi, we've got translations of the Hermetica that are the first really serviceable English translations that have been produced through projects like Project Hindsight, for example, astrological texts that had never been translated into English that existed in Greek or Latin are being translated. So we're almost experiencing in the here and now a mini renaissance of re-engagement with the occult, and it's for real. Now, of course, again, I view occultism as a kind of revivalist, reconstructionist adaptation. We only have threads, fragments from antiquity, but that's really what this movement is. We're reconnecting fitfully with foundational ideas that just dominated Western thought, and then were gone for centuries and centuries during what we used to call the Dark Ages, and were rediscovered again in fragments in the Renaissance. I don't think there's another culture or geographical continuity, unit, continent on Earth that's had that experience of their religious progression experiencing total interruption. So I felt a kind of emotional quality to this as I was working on the book, that this really goes back to our ancestry, but also our attempts, at least the attempts among some of us, to reclaim that ancestry and remake it, readapt it.
Well said. And I can tell you worked really hard on this book because of the way it flows. You can tell there's a cadence, there's a message from the very first word to how it goes. You could have easily sold out, Mitch. You could have written like, I'm going to write a blog post on Swedenborg, then a blog, and I'm just going to cut and paste them. I have this dry encyclopedic book, and hey, I'm off to the races. My book's out. But right. No, you can tell this is much different. There's a message. There's a rhyme. There's an energy. How all these pieces played with each other. All these occultists and thinkers depended on each other and flowed into the 20th century. So. Good job. Again, I can tell you really poured your own soul into this.
I really did. It was hard to believe when I finished it. And I'm excited and I'm nervous, to have it go out into the world.
Yeah. Good job. And it seems in a way you agree with me. I always say on this podcast, the age of Hermes, and your first chapter is the age of Hermes. And I think that's the other part too. You would say that, like you said, in Greco-Roman times, anything that was spiritual, philosophical, mystical fell under the umbrella of the great thought or Hermes. He kind of kept this inner world and this astral world there for humanity to enjoy. And then, even early Christian and Jews were saying, oh, Hermes was rubbing shoulders with Moses. I mean, he
That's
was
right.
the Elvis of those days. He was
Yeah.
the guy. And then, as your book is about how Hermes had to go underground and keep going underground in the Renaissance and Isaac Newton and up to today. So, yeah, in a way, this is sort of a love letter to Hermes, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, so much of what we identify as occult and esoteric today emanates from these Hermetic writings from late antiquity in the generations immediately following the death of Cleopatra and then later the death of Christ.
Mhm.
And it's interesting because things in our world today that we identify as ancient are not always as old as we really think. And occultism is a prime example. I start the book in the age of Cleopatra, which of course people don't necessarily think of as modern, because that's where the roots are. Because as these Greek Egyptian scribes, largely based in Alexandria, began writing down fragments of Egyptian esoteric philosophy in the Greek language, they left us Westerners with an expository record that we can at least get our arms around. And so it's a very valuable core sample of Egyptian thought. Hermeticism itself is a philosophy that's been dramatically neglected for, I would say, for centuries. It was regarded as kind of a mutt of late antiquity, a mixture of Neoplatonism, maybe with a little Egyptian sprinkles decorating it, maybe with some Egyptian costumery, but with a false conceit to antiquity, and basically just a reflection of mainline Neoplatonic thought. It's only since the 1970s and 80s, and more the 80s, that through parallel study of new findings and other aspects of Egyptiana, we've been able to accurately relocate the locus of Hermetic thought to Egypt. And that should heighten our sense of value. As far as I'm concerned, the first really truly serviceable English translation of the Hermetic literature is Brian Copenhaver's Hermetica, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 1992, not very long ago at all, post Elvis, and so this and some other translations followed that are very, very good, including one by Clement Solomon and a team of translators that Inner Traditions published in 2000. This is really very recent because the Hermetic literature, because its timeline was readjusted in the late Renaissance. There were hopes, as you were saying, that this literature went back to the age of Abraham and Moses, and through linguistic analysis, it was determined decisively to have emerged from late antiquity. And once that analysis gained sway, there was this kind of binary attitude among Western thinkers to dismiss the Hermetic project as a fraud, a failure, something unsavory, a fancy of the Renaissance, but not really important foundational Western thought. And for that reason, translations were neglected. So, for example, in Harvard's Loeb Classical Library, which is supposed to be the canonized temple of Western classicism, you will not find a single work of classical Hermeticism. It really is only in our generation that this material has attracted renewed focus, renewed scholarly effort, renewed translation. So my message to listeners is take advantage of this. Don't take this for granted. 100 years ago, people didn't have this stuff. There were translations of greater and lesser value, but they were very often turgidly written or pockmarked by a lot of errors. We have accurate, beautifully rendered translations of Hermeticism available to us today. Just a fragment of our ancient Egyptian past, but a very valuable one. And so, but it didn't get set down into Greek until very late antiquity. And that's a phenomenon that you find in a lot of our religious movements. There was oral history, there was symbol, things were passed on, maybe generationally, maybe through initiatory traditions, but it wasn't always common that stuff was written down. And if it did get written down, it might have gotten destroyed because somebody invaded somebody else. And, well, we got to get rid of their holy books because, this Stephen King stuff is going to cause a lot of trouble. And so...
Hit him with a bucket with blood, huh?
Right. So we get John Travolta out here. So we lose, we've lost so much, obviously. And a lot of our traditions are not as old as we think they are because they're reconstructed philosophies due to some of the schismatic activity that I was talking about. A lot of stuff in our world is a lot newer than we think. Even the Jewish liturgy, it goes back to the medieval era, and it's very beautiful and it's very steeped in history, but it's not ancient. And it just behooves us to remember that.
Yeah, there is actually in a sync, I have a quote from you that I think exemplifies what you're saying right now. And let me read it real quick. Understanding occult history requires accepting history as it really existed, not as I might want it to romantically exist. That does not imply that novelty is wrong, nor does it mean that because an idea is old and widely repeated, it is necessarily true, or because an idea is new, novel, or reformed, it is necessarily trifling. Religion has always been combinative and syncretic. Religion is drawn from a great variety of sources and ideas, which are shaped and reshaped across centuries. Very often, meaning is found by reading new stories into an object, idea, or practice, or reviving a theme or idea that has perhaps reached us in fragmentary ways. New forms are not illegitimate expressions. So that says it all, right, Mitch?
I think that observation was in the service of introducing the work of Elvis Levi, who did so much to really instigate the occult revival of the 19th century, which was brought to fruition by Madame Blavatsky about a generation after Levi. And Levi was really responsible for creating the modality of correspondences between tarot and Kabbalah. And Levi was such an aficionado of Kabbalah that he changed his own name, Louis Alphonse Constant, to Elvis Levi Zahad, which he thought was a kind of phonetic correlation to his French name. And Levi's correspondences between tarot and Kabbalah are completely sui generis. You'll find absolutely nothing in Kabbalah that corresponds with or even hints at Levi's theories. That doesn't mean there's not brilliance to them. He was operating as a kind of entrepreneur of ideas. He was casting about for a means of reconstituting occult tradition at a time and a place where the threads were very slender, very limited, and the field itself was considered completely discredited. This is very late into the so-called Age of Enlightenment. Universities, hospitals, cathedrals no longer have resident occultists as they did for a precious period of time during the Renaissance. And so Levi is trying to weave a full garment out of very thin threads. And he gleaned these ideas about correspondences between Kabbalah and tarot from earlier French writers, Comte de Mellet and Coeur de Gibelin, writing in the late 1700s. And then he just took the ball and he ran with it in a rather dramatic way. And he created this woven cloth that cemented among a generation or more of occultists that there was this intimate connection between tarot and Kabbalah, between tarot and ancient Egypt, and so on and so forth. Tarot is a secret hermetic codex that unlocks the mysteries of the universe.
Love it.
Corresponds to astrological signs and elements and numerals and Hebrew characters and so on and so forth. And although there are Hermetic influences in tarot, because Hermeticism is so foundationally important to us in the West, that's a total invention. That's a total invention. And also, by the way, a brilliant invention, and not one that I'm going to run down if people find value in it. And I want to say this, and I point this out very clearly in the book. Kabbalah as a tradition was neglected for centuries by Jewish authorities. It was regarded a little bit like the crazy aunt in the attic, like, well, we're responsible for her and we let her out once in a while, but it's not something that students, seminarians, rabbis were encouraged to study. It was
This is
considered,
after Shabbatai, Sevi, and Frank, and all those crazy guys I love. I
yeah,
love them because they were so out of their mind.
it was
They're
it was
such
it was
radical.
it was within the tradition, but it was also very countercultural and it was neglected.
Right.
Now that
Yeah.
started to change in about the year 1946, when the Israeli-German scholar Gershom Scholem wrote his book Currents in Jewish Mysticism. And Scholem, by any lights, would be considered a very conservative, mainline, rigorously classical Judaic scholar.
Mhm.
And yet, at the opening of his book, and this was the book that reignited the study of Kabbalah in the 20th century, at the opening of his book, he pays a kind of half tribute to Elvis Levi, saying, look, these are brilliant misconstructions, but at least the occultists, and he even includes Aleister Crowley in this, although he has less kind words for Crowley than Levi, but he even includes Crowley in this. He says, at least the occultists kept a flame of interest alive in Kabbalah at a time when traditional Jewish scholars were almost completely neglecting it. So people are almost too quick sometimes to write off Christian Kabbalah, occult Kabbalah, or modern iterations of Kabbalah as something that's somehow sundry or spoiled or betrayal of the tradition or what have you. And Gershom Scholem, who was one of the most responsible, conservative, and rigorous scholars of Kabbalah in the modern age, he opens his book with these writers saying, like them or not, these guys kept the flame alive. And then he moves on, but I really think people should take note of that, and it's underappreciated.
Same here. And do you have any misconceptions that still bother you or that modern New Agers and occultists still cling to? For example, I meet sort of a witch or a Wiccan, and they're still quoting Margaret Murray and the Horn God, and I'm like, do I correct them or I just whistle and walk away? Do you have any? Would you find any big misconceptions, even that still people cling on today about occultism?
I would say the primary misconceptions occur within mainstream letters, when once in a while they drunkenly wander into our neighborhood and feel obligated to write a piece about how fucked up we are. Their intellectual quality is very poor. It suffers from under research, which is a problem that is fixable, and they're too uninterested in their own subject to even bother to fix it. So,
Oh
for
my
example,
God.
if somebody quotes Margaret Murray to me or references the work of Gerald Gardner, I might, if I felt inclined to respond, and I don't always, because I think sometimes a person can be allowed to have his or her own experience, and I really believe that. I'm not going to take away an experience from somebody. If we're having a real discussion, I can say, look, as with Levi, there's a big historical chasm here, but that doesn't mean it's not meaningful. That doesn't mean that there's not pertinence to it. Just earlier today, I was talking to somebody about the question of Atlantis within occult philosophy. And I said, you could view Atlantis as a metaphor for the interest in some kind of prehistorical civilization, which is a warranted interest if you want to get into that material. But view it metaphorically. We don't have to pick these things apart like we're dissecting a laboratory frog or something. It doesn't need to be understood in this absolutist way. Now, as far as misconceptions go, I would say this. First of all, within the alternative spiritual culture, I think one of the things we have to get away from is trying to advertise our own seriousness by pissing on popular works like the Kabbalion or even The Secret. Yes, the dreaded Secret. I can't meet somebody, and not within 5 minutes they tell me how they revile The Secret. And I don't share that point of view. I have very deep differences with Rhonda Byrne, but I don't share that point of view, and I don't think that you establish seriousness by directing, your stream of piss at whatever you perceive downward of you. I don't see any reason for it. I think these works can be understood within their own terms. The Kybalion is a modern novelty written in 1918 that I believe does incorporate certain Hermetic themes in a very artful way. And the author of that book, William Walker Atkinson, I think did yeoman's work of combing through the very, very threadbare translations that were available to him and distilling some psychological points of value. That's it. It doesn't have to be some big Gird over what's authentic and what's not, especially since Hermeticism itself, until very recently, as I said, it was considered like an antique mutt of like pseudo-Egyptiana Neoplatonism. It wasn't that people would not speak of the Hermetica in serious tones outside of occult circles until the 80s, 90s, and sometimes not even until beyond. So we should be careful, where we direct our stream. And the other thing is, in terms of mainstream letters, and I write about this in the book, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but that's where the chief mangling of these ideas emerges from. So, mainstream journalists might write a piece about the traditionalists and misunderstand them entirely as these proto-Nazis, all of whom were involved in Holy Grail ceremonies with Himmler or some such. And it's so insufficient. And it's almost laughable in its intellectual conceit. It's just utterly insufficient. And likewise, mainstream folk will talk about Madame Blavatsky coining the law of attraction, which, if I'm not mistaken, you can still find on Wikipedia, that our digital library of Alexandria. And law of attraction, as I write about in the book, is a term was coined by the medium Andrew Jackson Davis in 1855. He was using it kind of in a Swedenborgian sense to talk about correspondences between the individual and unseen worlds or unseen dimensions, concentric circles in which humanity lives. It's actually a very Hermetic idea. And only later, Madame Blavatsky mentioned it in Isis Unveiled in 1877. And then later, new thoughters made it into more of a cause and effect law, a psycho-spiritual law of like attracts like. And so there is the law of attraction. It obviously touches people very, very deeply. Whatever one thinks of it, it touches so soundly and deeply on a hope, a wish that the individual has to be able to expand his or her sense of agency and personal capacity. And I think that wish should be honored. One can talk about whether it's effective. I dedicated a whole book to it called Daydream Believer. And the point is, the mainstream folk, they mangle this history, and they make it difficult for newcomers to occult and alternative esoteric Gnostic spirituality to kind of find their way, which is why we need to be writing our own literature. And I think we're doing a hell of a good job of it, at the moment.
Very well said. Yes, these are persistent. They're annoying. We've talked about it, like you just mentioned. Here we go again. Oh my God, somebody's saying that Jung and Steiner were friendly to the Nazis. Here we go again. Blavatsky was also, Blavatsky was a precursor of Nazism, and she was it's just these persistence from both sides. We're not even talking
from both sides.
It's like
it's a terrible historical blindness. It's simplistic to an extreme degree, and I write in detail about this stuff in the book about Steiner in the age of the Nazis. I mean, he died before the Third Reich, of course. Jung in the age of the Nazis, and I dedicate a lot of time to writing about the charges that Blavatsky seeded the Nazi movement. It's not only wrong historically, but it reflects a misunderstanding of how ideas morph and are clipped and pasted and sometimes forgotten about, lost in this kind of like readaptive amnesia. And it's very difficult to draw any kind of straight or direct lines from in the gestation of ideas, especially when schisms occur. And the rise of Nazism and fascism was obviously one such schism in the 20th century, where there's a complete kind of erasing of standards and ethics and values that were thought to be intrinsic in society, and a complete reworking, even if a short-lived one, And when you throw symbols and ideas of ancient vintage into that, they're going to get misused and perverted. I mean, that's part of the human story through history. Yeah. So people who rush to those conclusions, they're really doing well, what can I tell you? You know, I mean, people are entitled to entertain themselves however they wish. But if they're trying to get to a place of clarity, they're looking in the wrong direction.
Exactly. And people sometimes need to project. They need a boogeyman. Who better than the Gnostics, the Jews? There's a group that people like to just beat on across. Yeah. There was even this underground book that said it was a joint effort with the OSS and the Jews to create Elvis. Like came out of a lab or something.
That must be true. Yeah.
Yeah, of course, it had to happen. You know, they had these things back then. So, but yeah, the world. What about, and when you were writing this book, Mitch, was there a figure that really jumped out of you that you saw in brand new vistas, that you were impressed, that you were like, oh my God, I'm glad I've seen this new dimension of a figure. Now I even admire him more, or her, and I want to share with the world. Anybody like that appear in your book?
For me, that was Jack Parsons.
Really?
A lot of people get interested in Jack just because there was so much weirdness surrounding him. You know, here's Aleister Crowley, and here's Elbert Hubbard, and here's you know, Hubbard, and you know, all these different love trysts, and you know, love triangles and octagonals, and of course Jack's background as a scientist and his deep foray into magic always interests people, and all of that is of legitimate interest. But the thing that really turned me on about Jack, and that I really felt very touched by, was if you really dig into his life, including the few potent writings that he left behind, you can see the development of his search. And he was such a brilliant intellect. I mean, just to become a successful rocket engineer in the early jet age, that in itself is a remarkable accomplishment. And yet, and if that's all his life was, it would be a more than worthy life. But he also dove so deeply into magic and really wanted to find something, was deeply interested in, I would say, deific petition. Can you form a relationship with a deity and make things happen in the world and concretize will? And here he is working as a kind of North American protege deputy to Aleister Crowley. They're exchanging lots of letters, and one thing leads to another, and Crowley gets disgusted with Jack. Jack gets disgusted with him. Crowley felt Jack was weak in the face of the con job that L. Ron Hubbard worked on him. I'm not so sure that's true, but he was a very trusting guy. And ours is an ugly world. And so Jack finds himself on his own. And the project that he set himself to very shortly before he died was to question whether we need this very thickly rendered form of ceremonial magic anymore. He may have been reacting emotionally against the severed tie with Aleister Crowley, but I think he very earnestly asked the question, as a scientist, as a seeker, as a magician, is there a way to simplify all of this so that we don't need the rites, the rituals, the liturgy, the ceremony, the costumery, and all of that had been so cemented by Crowley and the Golden Dawn that it was almost de rigueur among Western occultists. And Jack asked, can we practice, get in touch with, readapt a Western magical tradition on much simpler terms? And then, of course, he didn't really get to explore that fully because his life was so tragically cut short. And when I discovered that side of him, I was very moved, because that's a lot like questions I've been asking myself recently and wondering the exact same thing. If the individual has a warranted belief, an informed belief in the extra physical capacities of the psyche, is that enough? Is that enough to, I'll put it metaphorically, to project will, let's say, to select circumstance, to contribute to causation? Because in effect, that's really what the magical operation is attempting to do, whether it's ceremonial, whether it's very simple, kind of chaos-based, sigil-based. I would say frequently the magician is seeking the favor of deities, is petitioning deities or demons or spirits, whatever term one wants to use. Um, but the ultimate end is the projection of one's agency, one's creative wish, one's true will, as Crowley would put it. So, is it possible that with the really remarkable record that we as a human community have today, both in terms of human testimony, in terms of our own individual search, and the wealth of material, legitimate, replicable material that's emerged from psychical research, mainstream fields like neuroplasticity, mind body, placebo, quantum physics, quantum theory, some of the conceptual models of the world that emerge from that, it's warranted to vest a sense of stock in the mind possessing, the psyche possessing extra physical capacities.
Yeah.
So if we know that, and I believe we do, can we loosen the bonds of ritual, liturgy, prayer? And so I was really touched to see that Jack was trying to work on that at the end of his life. And that for me became the story. Because I think he did lead a successful life as a great intellect, great magician, great scientist. I'm sorry it ended so early. But there's such gravity to his search. And that became the story for me. You know, I write about Hubbard and, you know, all the troubles and the parsonage and everything. You can't get away from it. But for me, the gravitational center is Jack's search.
Yeah, it was wonderful. Yeah, great story. Again, you talk about so many characters. I'm also glad you give a lot of props to Swedenborg. You know, Blavatsky gets vilified, Swedenborg gets overlooked, but they're both just massive giants.
Yeah.
And of course, yeah, and I love what you're saying about the mind. You know, I've talked about it's like we're right back at Hermes, because Hermes, as Gary Lachman said, Hermeticism is the religion of the mind. It's getting right back here to this universe in our head, which we forgot for like 2,000 years. And hopefully with your work, with great people like in the chat, occultists, modern Gnostics, we are getting back, and we can get rid of this materialism, reductionistic idea that is destroying the world, destroying nature, destroying civilization. But I don't want to get on a soapbox unless you do too. But the other thing I wanted to mention too is, yeah, what I admire about Parsons and admire about it is that no matter how bad things had got, whether he lost his money, was fired, he lost his woman, for him, meeting his holy guardian angel, the magic was always the most important thing. It's like I admire people that no matter what happens, meeting the divine is still what they wake up to do. And you see that in Crowley too. Regardless if Crowley had money, he was stuck in Mexico, whatever, he had one thing. And even at the end of his life, Crowley was still a heroin addict, no money. He was still, even, I mean, you read the Elvis book, even late in his life, he's fat, his health is dying, he's on drugs. He was still doing yoga, karate, he was still meditating. I admire individuals like that they never give up when it comes to spiritual pursuit. What do you think of that?
Totally. And I would include in that the magician John Dee.
Of course, yeah. He always
Levi, Austin Osman Spare, and of course Madame Blavatsky herself. You know, I somehow it escaped my notice, but she was only 59 when she died. Looked a great deal older, yeah. And
but she did have an Elvis lifestyle.
Oh, she really did, and she accomplished so much in so short a time, and you know, it was really just extraordinary. And I think it's hard for people in today's world to conceive of the brutality that existed back then meaning just even the 19th century, and how steep a price you could pay for your beliefs. Like, for example, Eliphas Levi, before he became dedicated to the occult, was a Christian socialist, an early proto-socialist. Well, you know, he was thrown in jail by the monarchical regime at that time for subversive thought. His books were seized. He spent it was either 9 or 11 months in a Parisian prison. The records are unclear. His publisher was jailed. They were both fined. So these people had to play skin in the game in ways that we rarely can relate to, at least in North America in the 21st century. Everything is name calling, everything is posturing, everything is how brave I was to tweet about this and so on. And there's absolutely no skin in the game, even to the point of anonymity. Mm-hmm. And you look at Blavatsky, you were saying she gets vilified in Western culture, and yet Western culture also, they can't stop vilifying her, which is suggestive of something. One could say, well, she died in 1891, and we'll just forget about her as this Victorian oddity, like a whalebone corset. And yet Madame Blavatsky just keeps coming up and keeps getting attacked. And she split open Western culture in a way because she committed the ultimate unforgivable sin, which is claiming phenomena from the unseen or spirit world as a living empirical presence in our physicalist world. And that is the vast Age of Enlightenment, great forbidden taboo in Western culture. You can speak of religion in terms of theology, maybe in terms of some sort of individual epiphany or conversion experience, certainly through poetry, through myth, through parables. Maybe people could talk about the mind-bending experience they had on ayahuasca or acid or something. But to talk about the actual presence of physical phenomena from some commonly unobserved facet of experience in our world is the ultimate sin, which is why ESP research, however soberly it's conducted, deeply juried, careful and unpolluted in its methodology, ESP research is vilified even more than Madame Blavatsky or some overt expressions of occultism. I sometimes joke, but within every joke there's truth that when I feel I'm taking too much heat for writing about ESP, I go back to writing about Satanism because there's less heat. I mean, you should see the attacks I get for my ESP stuff. So. And so Blavatsky, she committed that sin, whatever one makes of her individually. And I will always defend her as a being of greatness, because when she picked up and left New York City with Colonel Olcott in 1878 and relocated to India, she had only another a decade in front of her to live. They were not in good health. She was morbidly obese. Henry Olcott had a gouty leg. There were no protections against diseases or parasites or illnesses that you were going to attract outside your home base. They didn't speak the language. They had no particular base of financial or political support, and they just showed up and they worked a worldwide revolution. Early members of the Theosophical Society were decisive in the formation of the Indian National Congress. Gandhi spoke very plainly and bluntly about this in interviews, wrote about it in articles, letters to newspapers. I quote him in the book with scrupulous referencing. Referencing is very important to me because I want people to see that these are not suppositions. I mean, I'm using the tools of a mainstream historian. These are just neglected pieces of history. And we can't understand ourselves if we're neglecting forces like a Blavatsky or like a Swedenborg that did so much to shape our conception of life, even if, and especially if, we haven't heard of them, because it's when things stop having a name attached to them that they've just kind of entered the groundwater.
Yeah, that's really well said. I mean, even Kurt Vonnegut said Blavatsky is the mother of occultism. Without her, it's like Elvis without rock. Right. We would be, the world would be complete. We probably might not even be having this conversation.
No, I would say, as I was working on this book, I came to realize just more and more the extent to which Blavatsky's fingerprints are everywhere, even where you don't expect it, like the revival of witchcraft, modern Wicca witchcraft. Blavatsky's successor, Annie Besant, had a daughter,
Firecracker.
Mabel Besant. Yeah, Annie Besant was just extraordinary. She had a daughter, Mabel Besant, and Mabel founded an occult theosophical lodge in southern England that attracted Gerald Gardner after he retired from the civil service and lived on the southern English coast. And that seems to have amped up his interest in esotericism, occultism, and then, it's just a short leap later to when he wrote Witchcraft Today. So you'll even find indirectly Blavatsky's fingerprints on practices like Wicca, with which she's not often associated.
And let's not forget, she was a woman. She was to change the world in the 19th century. I mean, people don't understand how far we've come back. For her to do what she did was monumental. For her to being a woman, it's almost like it has to be magical, because, again, her impact on culture and the world. And yeah, we've come a long way. In the 1960s, witchcraft was still illegal in England. Here in the United States in the 1960s, blacks had to drink from a different water fountain, and gays were being lobotomized for being gay. So we have come a long way, people. Don't try. And this is because many of these occultists were also social reformers, like Annie Besant and others.
Right.
They truly understood the idea how we're basically equal under the eye of magic, if you would. Hermes.
Yeah. And it's actually only coming into discussion nowadays the extent to which Annie Besant's book, Thought Forms, which she produced with Charles Webster Leadbetter, influenced the germination of abstract art. And I was privileged to work on a reissue of that book a couple of years ago. So this book that came out in 1905 produced these thought form images through Besant and Leadbetter's collaboration with artists, that within which you can see the earliest development, not only of abstract art, but I would say even early psychedelia. And the visionary nature of this book is one that we're only coming to terms with right now, today.
Wow, that's incredible. Yeah, so much richness in your book for the audience. He takes us on this journey, talk everything we've talked about, but also what I like too is you also tackle, again, modern, the latest 21st century occultism, the idea of parallel universes, ESP, all the different things that are coming through. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that, because I had no idea that you were corresponding with Steve Bannon. I was like,
oh yeah,
where did I miss that one? Tell the audience
proud.
about you and your proud days with the alt-right.
Steve reached out to me after my book Occult America was first published in 2009. Right. And he was not a known guy then. He said, look, you probably don't know who I am. I'm a financier, a conservative documentarian. I really loved your book. And, I wondered, well, what did you love about it? And he was turned on by the chapters on the burned over district of central New York State, and the way that place in the first half of the 19th century was just the springboard for everything innovative and radical, novel in American life. It was the birthplace of spiritualism, birthplace of new religious movements, Mormonism, Seventh-day Adventism, birthplace of suffragism.
Wasn't Joseph Smith from there?
Sure, Joseph Smith.
And he knew about Abraxas. That blew me away.
Right.
So many treasures in your book.
Like family,
Joseph Smith was into Abraxas. Oh my God.
Yeah. America's utopian experiments took root there. I mean, you got Shaker villages that started there, spread as far north as Maine, as far south as Kentucky, based on belief. It was a hard life, sort of apropos of what you were saying about the seeker, always just returning to the search. People didn't join the Shakers because it was a vacation. They joined it in the search. And all this started in central New York State. So anyway, he was interested in that. We remained friendly for a couple of years. He got very famous very quickly. But nowadays we're not in touch. Not my world.
Yeah. Things have changed. But What do you think about modern occultism? Because I mean, there's so much. Again, obviously, Gary Lockman deals with it
Yeah.
in Dark Star, witch talk, meme magic. There's so much going on and so many new things that are happening. What do you think? Do you think we're in the right direction, or what do you think 2023 occultism will be like?
I think
Or is like?
I think we're in the right direction. Yeah. I mean, look, there are scholars in academia, some of whom you've collaborated with, who are doing wonderful things in terms of esoteric studies. April DeConnick, Jeff Kripal, Walter Hanegraaff. There are independent scholars, Richard Smoley, Gary Lackman, a whole really wonderful wide range of people. I mean, my God, I haven't even mentioned Jocelyn Godwin, who I consider the occultism's great man of letters. You know, there's quality output going on today.
Jeff Kripal, yeah, there's
Kripal,
yeah.
Project Hindsight and the work that they're doing to translate ancient Hellenic astrological texts into English. You've got Western astrologers studying the Vedic astrology system. You've got good, sturdy translations of the Hermetica coming out. You've got new, pretty sturdy translations of the Gnostic literature coming out. We're still digesting the impact of Nag Hammadi and probably will for a long time to come. I'm sitting watching the Barbie movie, and at least for the first 20 minutes, that is a Gnostic film. That is a Gnostic film, you know.
It does have elements, yeah.
Here's this, you know, she's living in this dream world and everything is just fine until existential thoughts come in, and then the Lemmi question fucks everything up, you know. And I thought, you know, there's so many films that people identify quite rightly, you know, you name it, Truman Show. I mean, we've watched some of them together that are legitimately grounded in a Gnostic outlook. And yeah, so I think actually things are going pretty damn well. I'm very excited by the quality of literature that's out there. I posted a piece at Medium called, I think it was the 10 most revelatory books I read while writing modern occultism. And of those 10, it was a very short list, too short, but of those 10, I would say 8 are pretty recent, you know, including some that have been published in the 2020s. So I think actually occult studies are really deepening. And as I alluded earlier, I believe we may be in the midst right now of a kind of petite renaissance of occultism and esotericism attributable to Nag Hammadi, the Hermetic literature, the translations, the new Hermetic scholarship. Walter Hanegraaff just published a very, very important book on our Hermetic source material and how problematic it is, which is something we owe it to ourselves to be aware of. And I would also say this is all being helped along by the mainstreaming of the UFO thesis. Because the UFO thesis has gone mainstream and brings with it questions of interdimensionality, that starts to interact with the interests of people who care about the occult and metaphysics. I mean, if we're talking about an invisible world, an unseen world, a dimension or intersection of time or undulating string, these are all just names for things that we can't wrap our arms around. They're all metaphorical in a certain sense. And that's part of the conversation that I think students of the occult want to be in on. So, and plus, it's hard to say how a zeitgeist gets shaped. I mean, what shaped the 60s? I don't know. When did it really begin? Was it the Beats? Was it Kennedy? Was it Lenny Bruce? Was it the Beatles? You know, when did the 60s officially begin? And why did this zeitgeist get so fully shaped so that by 1968, Elvis's comeback special, he's singing a protest-infused song, you know, which you couldn't imagine Elvis having done like even months earlier. And so it may be in our own time, as the UFO thesis continues its establishment into the mainstream firmament of thought. It's the subject that can't be avoided. That'll bring ripples with it, and that may further interest in and more important than interest in, depth of quality of the occult. I don't know if more people are interested in it today. I have no insight on that, but in terms of quality, which is what really matters. I think this is a golden moment.
I would agree with you. These are strange times, but that's a good thing. Well, awesome. I've got one question from the audience, and then I want to talk about your event in a few days that we should definitely include. But I had first thanks for where's all my buttons here. Thank you very much, Chester, for the super chat, the support. Really appreciate it. Let me know if you have a question. I'll try to get to it. But Matthew, who was you were chatting with him briefly before the show, he sent me a message on Discord, but his question was, what are your thoughts on occult diet practices? I recently read Dion Fortune's Sane Occultism, where she makes cases for both vegetarian and non-vegetarian diets. In fact, she says that vegetarian diet may actually be detrimental for the occult student in the long run. Do you have a stance on this, or?
It's not an area that I've studied. It probably has its roots in some of our medieval grimoires. I have not really participated in dietary driven programs, which exist in the mainstream religions too, of course. We have Lent within Catholicism. We have, Yom Kippur is coming up within Judaism, where you don't eat at all, and then of course you have the laws of kashrut within Judaism. I've never particularly been interested in pursuing a line of search that way, so I have to confess lack of familiarity.
Yeah, I always say follow your gut. I had once a premonition, and I ended up being 7 years vegetarian. But I knew my body, something told me, take this road. And now these days I've come
I was
back.
vegetarian for 10 years for ethical reasons. But I started to feel like, for me, the diet wasn't very healthy. And so I started eating meat again. I'm not at ease with it, but that's where I am right now.
That's what the voice said, is that you're not getting enough. Your brain is going to collapse if you don't get more meat in it or more in the voice. So I just went back recently, but so it is. Or we can do what the Gospel of Thomas says: what enters your mouth will not defile you. It's what comes out of your mouth which will defile. Which people on the internet, I wish they would follow, right?
Well, I do wish they would follow it, right? But
what you type on the keyboard will defile you.
That suggests part of the reason, I think, although most people didn't have the opportunity to read that, they might have heard it said, and that suggests the reason why I think Christianity had such a pull on people in late antiquity. They were getting very sick of the thickness of liturgies and letters of the law and so forth.
Yeah, for certain.
A lot of different people in the Mediterranean, Persian area.
Yeah. And I always loved Shabbatai Zevi and how he would just break laws in the synagogue. Everywhere he went, he would just piss people off. He was like a rock star. I like these kind of people.
Yeah.
But here is, you want to talk about your presentation in a few days?
Oh, sure. I'm flying to Los Angeles tomorrow, Tuesday, the 19th. And I am going to be giving a presentation at the Philosophical Research Society, first on Wednesday night, the 20th. And that's going to be with the artist Chet Zar, who is just an extraordinary creator of monsters. And he is a painter. He is a sculptor. He had a really, really distinguished career for a very long time as a special effects maestro in the film world. And Chet is just a dark genius with an enormous heart. And so I'm going to be giving a presentation with him Wednesday night. Friday night is the launch of Modern Occultism. Friday night, I'm delivering a lecture, and I'll be doing a book signing. This is at the Philosophical Research Society in Griffith Park. They're prs.org. And so Friday night, I'll be giving a general lecture on the themes in modern occultism and signing the book. So it's kind of an exciting week.
And is this just a physical event, both, or
you can watch it on Zoom and online as well. So if you go to PRS, they have like a ticket link, and if you can be there in person, terrific. if you can't be there in person, you could do a Zoom thing. And they also have the book for sale, but the book is available anywhere.
Ah, very cool. So you'll be there Wednesday night, on Wednesday and Friday night.
Wednesday and Friday night this week. Yeah.
All right, we'll check it out. I will definitely throw it on the show notes, including the book of the link for the book, yada yada yada. Awesome. Oh wait, one more question. This is an odd one, but thank you, Dana Mutta. Mitch, you wore Toppy Cross on conference. They still active? Do you know what she's saying?
Oh yeah, we've got lots of Toppy crosses here. Yeah, they're floating around.
What's a Toppy?
Toppy is Temple of Psychic Youth. They were a punk occult arts collective, really brutally suppressed unfairly during the Satanic Panic.
Yeah, you've written about them.
Yeah. Two of the key founders, Genesis Peorage and Laura Peorage, and their daughters Caressa and Janess, were unable to return to England. They were off feeding the poor and the destitute in Nepal. They heard, hey, Scotland Yard has just raided Toppy houses in London and Bristol. All these fake, trumped up, satanic ritual abuse charges. I mean, just complete calumny and fantasy. All of it discredited. And in a relatively short time too. But because these guys were in Scotland Yard's crosshairs, and there were kids involved, they couldn't return home. So they had to exile here in the United States. And my partner, Jacqueline Costello, is working on a documentary about this. So it's a topic of deep concern to me. Toppy, strictly speaking, is not active today, but there's so many seedlings that have spread from it. I would say the influence and those who were part of that experimental period are still producing very potent work.
Well, cool. And didn't you get a Yaldabaoth Demiurge tattoo recently too?
I beg your pardon?
Didn't you get like a Demiurge Yaldabaoth tattoo?
Oh yeah.
Show the world that you're.
Yeah, this is upside.
I see the Demiurge.
I sort of honor like the different roles that Abraxas played, among different Gnostic sects. For some Demiurge, for some deity or being like a sun god to be appealed to. So I like the ambiguity of the figure and how, as you said, the Joseph Smith's family knows about Brock and the power of Abraxas, as they said it, and.
Do you know that Abraxas was Charles Manson's patron god?
Oh, great.
Well, that's because Herman Hesse was so popular in the late 60s in LA. So the Beach Boy, I mean, he was like people reading Damien. And of course, the book talks about Abraxas and all that. So, the Wilson brothers were very into Abraxas, obviously. Carlos Santana, you know what I mean? He was just a popular god, and Charles Manson just also adopted him.
And now how to win friends and influence people. Apparently, according to there's a very good journalist. His name is escaping me. He did Jeff Gwynn. He did a bio of Manson a few years ago, and he uncovered that he was reading Dale Carnegie in Reformatory to learn how to win friends and influence people. It is a very shrewd program. It's a very, very Carnegie had a lot of insight into human nature. That book also shows up in Roman Polanski's film, The Ninth Gate.
Oh, of course.
How we got from Abraxas to Dale Carnegie, I can't say, but it all adds up.
It started with Carrie and John Travolta, Buckets of Blood, and here we are. Yeah, with Charles Manson. Such a positive note. See, we are Gen X. We can't be happy, Mitch. It's just not in our DNA.
I don't know that I'm Gen X. I'm not sure. I may not have made it within the generational parameters.
When were you born? I think you are.
November 23rd, 1965.
Yeah, you're Gen X.
Okay.
I think so.
I belong.
Yeah.
All right, cool.
Yeah. So awesome. Well, why don't we wrap it up? Any last words you want for the audience about your book, Modern Occultism? I really enjoyed it. Like, you reading. It took me like 2 days, and I was like, again, it was not this encyclopedic heavy stuff. It was just a good book to just sit there and enjoy and get all these wonderful insights and get sort of a good view of Hermes.
Yeah, I appreciate it enormously. And if you know, if the description of the book turns you on, you know, I appreciate your support of it enormously. It's out in print, digital, and audio starting tomorrow. And I participated this summer in a conference that Miguel and his colleagues organized. It was held in Wheaton, Illinois, at the campus of the Theosophical Society. And what was it called? Meet the Archons.
Meet the Archons.
Is that a play on Meet the Fockers, by the way?
Yeah, or Meet the Flintstones, kind of both.
Yeah, okay. And so Miguel, you know, brought together different Gnostic seekers, scholars, writers, some in academia, some independent folks, some with no apparent source of living or household, but everybody, you know, dedicated and intellectually powerful. And it was such a wonderful, wonderful exchange. And that's the kind of thing that makes me respond in the affirmative when I'm asked, do I think occult studies right now are in a good place? They're really in a good place. And, you know, I was reminded of something as we were talking about it, and this is a bit of repetition, so forgive me, but I think it's important. You know, we often speak of the potency of a movement based upon its outreach or the breadth of its appeal, its number of members. But really, the only measure of health in a thought movement is its quality of ideas, the excellence with which these ideas are spoken about, written about, turned into media so that we can have an exchange. And we really have to remember, it behooves us as a subculture to remember that we're not here for the numbers. You know, numbers are nice and numbers can be important, but we're not here for that. We're here for the quality of the exchange. So you facilitated that. The show facilitates it. And I think we're in good shape.
Yeah, and I think you hit it on the head. It's about listening to other points of view and just that's it. Listen, at the conference, there were theosophists, there were occultists, there were right wingers, there were Gnostics, there were people with all this varying degree of spiritual and political ideas, and everybody at the parties during the conference questions just listened and asked questions. Nobody got offended, that's a victory, Mitch. Nobody got offended.
It was a real exchange, and there was a diffuse group of people there, you know, as you were just alluding. Yeah, and you know, when people respect the search, you can have an authentic exchange, and it doesn't just evolve into these contests. And that's it. You know, if people respect the search, so much becomes possible.
Amen. All right. Well, that's a good positive note to end it on. And great idea. Thank you, those in the chat room. I liked your ideas. I like somebody said Elvis Presley. He kind of created his own little egregore.
You have to use
that his own little egregore. So that could be a movie. So good quotes. Thanks for the support, everybody. Definitely get Mitch's book. You won't regret it. It will be on your shelf. You will lean on it throughout your life when you're looking for ideas, inspiration. Check out Mitch in LA this week, online or physical, and that's it. So good Monday. Yeah. So Mitch, as always, thanks for coming on, and always glad to talk to you at any point, you know.
Thanks for everything, man. I greatly appreciate it, and be in touch soon.
All right. Well, everybody, have a good rest of your Monday. Have a good rest of your week, and we will have some shows soon this week and next week. As I always say, write your own gospel, live your own myth. And yes, this is the age of Hermes. Enjoy it.